In the almost 8 months since Russia's invasion of Ukraine began, yesterday Vladimir Putin unleashed some of the most blistering attacks on multiple cities, including the capital Kiev. And it comes after a blast attributed to the Ukrainian resistance crippled a bridge in Crimea that serves as a Russian supply line on Saturday. The Ukrainian President Volodymyr Zelensky yesterday tweeting the world once again seeing the true face of a terrorist state that is killing our people. 11 people have died and 64 were injured across 8 blasts. For the latest developments, we are now joined by CBS News foreign correspondent, somebody, of course, many of us are familiar with, Deborah Patta. Thank you so much for talking to us this morning. You've just returned from Ukraine. Looking at the latest developments, is this the fight back of a cornered and wounded bear? Is Putin getting more desperate?
Absolutely. He is getting very desperate. This is a man who has been pushed into a corner because in little more than a month, the war in Ukraine has turned abruptly from a very grueling, largely static artillery battle to escalating into this multi-level conflict. The Ukrainians have started winning. They have started clawing back and taking back territory. They are doing exceptionally well in the north. They've literally taken back most of Kharkiv. They have gains in Kherson. They have gains in the east in Luhansk. And now this bridge in Crimea. Crimea, that you remember, was taken in 2014. And to strike at the heart of what, Vladimir Putin is so proud of, was a bitter, bitter blow. And so this is a man who is lashing out. On some levels, you could say, is it a sign of strength? Is it a sign of what Russia is capable of? But it's also a sign of weakness, of a man who, this is the only way he can fight. Not a single military target was hit in the more than 80 missiles unleashed. Not a single military target. Playgrounds, public parks, bridges, electricity, water, cut off. That is the kind of war and person that Ukraine is dealing with.
Cruise missiles on civilian targets, as you point out. I mean, he's really making it clear that his war is not just against the regime, but against the people of Ukraine.
And that has been the case for over 7-8 months now. It's not new. This is simply because the world is once again paying attention to Ukraine, which is another way these missile strikes have backfired, because it's rebrought and refocused attention on Ukraine when, a lot of people got sort of bored or desensitized to the daily news headlines that have been taking place since the invasion began in February. What this has done is highlighted what Russia is capable of once again, probably will send more weapons to Ukraine. So, it's backfiring. But this is a war that has been declared largely on civilian people from the very, very start. I've been to Ukraine several times. I've been covering this for weeks and weeks on end. And the overwhelming thing that we see, Bongani, the overwhelming thing is civilians are the people who are paying the highest cost. Their buildings, their homes destroyed. Yeah. Torture on an industrial scale. Death of civilians on an industrial scale. I went to a forest in Izium, which was recently liberated in the counteroffensive by Ukrainians. And amidst the joy, a forest filled with the bodies of over 400 civilians, over 440 civilians. It was horrific. The smell of death overwhelming there, and many of those civilians tortured, their hands bound, containing stab wounds. There were children there. It wasn't just people who were killed in shellings, which again is a war declared on civilians. These people were deliberately targeted and executed. There were 12 torture chambers in that region alone.
That sounds absolutely horrific. I mean, 20th of October, it'll be exactly 8 months since this began. There is a view in the West that the longer this drags on, the less certain Putin's future will appears. Is that wishful thinking? Because it just doesn't seem there is an end in sight.
It's a long war. It's going to take a lot longer. But I think what we're seeing now, it's certainly in Ukraine, is the birth of hope. The hope that this nation could win is the feeling that you get when you are there. And yes, yesterday was a day of terror, a massive assault, the most widespread assault since this invasion began, in which over 12 different places were hit in those missiles, and Kiev, which has not been targeted much in the last few months, people rushing to safety for the first time into those air raid shelters once again. We haven't seen a lot of that, but Putin has to balance things very, very carefully. There is growing criticism of his war back at home, and a lot of analysts are saying that what happened yesterday was to appease the hawks amongst him, was to show that he is capable of this kind of strength, that he wasn't going to take things lying down. But this is a beleaguered force. We went to a base that had been abandoned by Russians, and what we saw there was panic. People fled in terror. They were taken by surprise. There was pots still, almost cooking. They were just left there, a poker game left there as it was, religious icons. They fled, leaving behind a lot of their weapons as well. And now he's called up people who have not fought in a war, most of them ever. And they are the ones that are going to be sent to the front line. That is a sign of desperation. When you are recruiting mercenaries from prison, as they are doing in Russia with the Wagner group, that is a sign of desperation. And you've seen Putin threatening nuclear power, the use of nuclear force once again. Again, that is an act of desperation. And he's going to have to balance that very carefully, because if he does that, he unleashes a bigger response globally. And can he sustain that? There's signs of resistance within Russia that he won't talk about as well. A few weeks ago, you had that targeted hit in the center of Moscow, in which a senior person was targeted close to Putin, and his daughter was killed in that bomb blast. Stuff that is very seldom spoken about. So yes, there is growing signs of resistance within Russia, and certainly outside of Russia. And many soldiers, I spoke to one who had defected, a Russian soldier. They don't want to fight in Vladimir Putin's war. Hundreds of thousands have left since that call-up began.
Yeah. Deborah Pat, I appreciate your time bringing us the latest there from Ukraine and what's unfolding there. And let's hope he doesn't drag the whole world and the rest of us into this conflict.
Current events, developing stories,
tough questions.
Your voice making a difference.
This is Breakfast with Bongani Bingwa.